Resource Development CropTalk webinar. If you have any questions during this presentation, please type them into the question section of the GoToWebinar menu and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and you will receive a link to the recording. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Lori. I'd like to welcome everybody to the September 2nd edition of CropTalk. And today we are going to switch gears to a crop that is being grown for two reasons out in Manitoba, I guess. One was grain corn as well as silage, and a disease that has been showing up, and not one that is showing up in a lot of places, but just one that we're starting to see more of. And I thought it would be a good opportunity to get David Kaminsky, our field crop pathologist, to make a few comments and help us in identifying Goss's wilt and corn. So we're gonna have that, and then after that, Ann Kirk is going to talk a bit about a survey we're doing in corn this year, a disease survey we're doing in corn, and we'll go to that, and then we'll go to our crop scouting panel as usual to answer some of the questions that have come in this week. But to start off, I'm just going to go through a few slides regarding where we are kind of in harvest situation right now. And as you can see here that we're about 50% done our spring wheat, and about 62% done barley, and about 40% done oats. And so we're lagging a little bit behind our 3-year average, but that probably comes to show because of the conditions we're facing this last week to week and a half. Lots of rain and just damp conditions in general, which is definitely delaying harvest. When you look at the rest of the crops, canola just starting, which is definitely lagging behind our 3-year average as well. So I'm just missing a slide here, so I'm just gonna make a few comments on spring wheat and barley. Getting lots of reports on spring wheat that yields are right around average, and in some cases below average. Trying to figure out why this is. We're seeing maybe some of the issues from this spring, cool, damp conditions, and just the crop never got off to a great start. I'm getting reports from some producers that the seed is smaller in some cases, and this might be more of a variety thing. What I'm hearing is some varieties maybe just aren't quite doing as well this year, and we're getting a smaller seed. When you look at the oats, talking to producers, I think with a lot of the reason we're behind in harvest there is because we have pre-harvest working fairly slowly because, again, of our cool, damp conditions, and so a lot of producers are having some difficulty strike cutting. Also, with a lot of the oats not being sprayed, we're also seeing the same thing where it's just a lot of green material still in the bottom, and the straw is just too wet, so producers are having some issues there. Regarding the canola, like I mentioned, not a lot of canola has been harvested to date, but from the guys I've been talking to, they're saying the seed is small this year. They just don't have that big plump seed that they have had over the last couple of years, and so that's relating to lower yields, lower test weights. So I think that's an issue too that we're looking at right now too. So just a few comments on the on some of the issues that some of the producers are facing. The other thing too is a lot of producers are taking off wet grain. There's a lot of grain being taken off in that 18% and higher range. Lots of aeration happening, lots of drying going on. So that's another reason why we're not as high as our 3-year averages. Producers are starting to run out of air bins, starting to run out of dryer space, and it's just taking a little bit longer to get the crop in. Wanted to put this slide up because I got the picture sent to me on the right-hand side, middle or end of last week, I guess it was, and this is for the Russell area, and we're looking at temperatures from next Monday to next Wednesday of anywhere from +2 to +3 for our evening lows, and so I went on to our average daily date for our first fall frost, and when you look at a lot of the areas, I guess especially where that Russell area is in, our average first fall frost is anywhere from the 6th to the 11th, and that's that map is based on a risk of 50%. So basically 1 out of every 2 years that we'll usually get some type of frost in those time periods. So we're definitely getting into that time where we're going to be watching for fall frost, and I think producers are going to start managing accordingly as well. I found this precipitation map for, the temperature map, probably the probability of below normal temperatures, and this is a US map. So when you look at the next 8 to 14 days, which will take us out to the 14th of September, you see coming up through the middle of the states, the probability of below normal temperatures is definitely something that's going to be hitting Manitoba center and front as it comes up through the states. Now, it's going to depend on winds, I guess, as to and the jet stream as to how far it gets up, but it definitely doesn't look like it's going to miss us, that's for sure. And then precipitation for the next 8 to 14 days. And when you look at precipitation, we're looking at probabilities of below normal, which would be great. We don't need a lot of precipitation, and right now we need dry conditions to start bringing that crop in. I mentioned at the start that a couple of the crops that are doing fairly good right now I was talking with some of the crops that are doing fairly good, and when you look at 2 of them that we don't talk a lot about are corn and sunflowers, and the silage corn and grain corn, I haven't seen this tall in years. It's amazing how big it's gotten, and when you look at some of the sunflowers in the field and some of the heads that are developing, it's just amazing right now. So they've had good growing conditions. They're doing okay. We just need the weather to cooperate and get these crops in. When we talk about corn, and I mentioned that as we're growing more of it, we're starting to see more, starting to look at it more and watch it grow, and we're starting to see new things happening. And that's why I thought it would be good to get David on to talk about Goss's wilt. So I think right now what we'll do is we'll pass over the presentation to David, and we'll start talking about Goss's wilt.
Okay, thanks, Lionel. I'm starting with a fact sheet from the University of Nebraska because that has always been sort of the epicenter of Goss's wilt, where it originated. We'll look at that in the presentation in a while. But when it causes a wilt, the bacteria degrade the inside of the stalk, and you get this bacterial ooze coming out. So far, this has not been documented in Manitoba. We've only seen leaf symptoms, not the wilt phase. So Goss's wilt may be a bit of a misnomer for us, but that's the way it's referred to. So I have to acknowledge my predecessor, Holly Dirksen, because she really put together all of the material that's in this presentation. I've added really nothing except what I can tell you about the disease. These are the very earliest symptoms. It starts off as a water-soaked patch on the leaf. The bacteria at this stage are working inside the leaf haven't come out to the surface. Bacteria get into the leaf through the natural openings, the stomates in the leaf, but also through injuries to the leaf. These are more advanced symptoms of the leaf phase of Goss's wilt, and this freckling, as they call it, is kind of a grayish discoloration along the edge of the lesion. And you can also see some places where the bacteria have oozed out onto the surface and later dried. And the next slide will show that this can give the leaf a glossy appearance, or the sun will glint off of it because of the bacteria that have come out and dried on the surface of the leaf. We're going to be doing some surveying this year, and I hope Anne will come on to talk about that in a while. We'll go into fields and look at 50 plants, but often with Goss's wilt, we find that the distribution is both in patches and often on the edges of fields. So Morgan Cott, the agronomist with the corn growers, says that she can often do a drive-by survey with this kind of a disease. So I showed you that bacterially oozing stem, but this is more typical, or what we might see initially, where the bacteria are causing a blockage of the vascular system and causing a wilt. Again, this has not been documented in Manitoba to date. People sometimes ask about whether seed transmission is the way that's introduced. Well, seed transmission can occur, but it's usually there at a very low rate, and it's not considered a major source of new infection. The residue of the old crop is. Of course, we wonder if it got to Manitoba on seed. There really is no evidence of that. And companies would, if they had Goss's wilt in a trial or in a seed production area, they would eliminate those seeds that are known to be infected. It's spread to almost all of the corn growing areas in Manitoba, and it's also found in corn growing areas in Alberta. So at this point, I want to tell you that the name of the pathogen is Clavibacter nebraskensis, and that's because Nebraska was considered sort of the epicenter of the disease originally, but as corn production has spread out, the disease has followed wherever it is. Now, at one time it was known as Clavibacter michiganense pathovar nebraskensis. Interesting side note, there is no cross infection between these two diseases, but bacterial ring rot in potatoes is Clavibacter michiganense subspecies Sepidonicus. So they are the same genus of bacterium, but again, there's no cross between them. Surveys were done in Manitoba from 2014 to 2016, and by 2016 they were doing about 140 fields as a presence or absence survey, and at that time in 2016, 42% of the fields that we looked at had Goss's wilt symptoms. The prevalence was lower, that is the number of fields showing positive, but the disease incidence was higher. And I don't know, 2016 may have been one of the last wetter years. This slide says Goss's wilt distribution in 2015, but Holly has overlaid the results from the survey of 2016. So if I flip back, you'll see that some of the areas that were negative have turned positive, but the pinkish color for that just turns those RMs orange. You can also see that the disease has been found further out in any of the areas where corn production occurs. The survey was discontinued in 2017, and again, we are looking for a methodology for assessing the severity of the disease in the fields. What about management? Well, first of all, fungicides have no impact whatsoever on bacterial disease like Goss's wilt. Rotation is one of the key elements, and the bacterium can survive, according to the fact sheets from Nebraska, for 10 to 15 months on corn residues. So if you're growing corn even a year or with a year break, there is probably going to be some residue in the field that can be the start of a new infection. Of course, corn on corn on corn is an absolute no-no, and that's where we see the highest intensity of this disease. Weed control in intervening years may be important because of weeds susceptibility, or that they can host the disease from year to year, and those include green and yellow foxtail and barnyard grass. And to that list, you can add annual ryegrass, grain sorghum and Sudan grass, and also big blue stem, which is a native plant that you often see growing along roadsides. It's a tall native grass that has kind of reddish purple stems, and it's also a host for Goss's wilt. Tillage, which buries crop residue, may have some impact in more rapidly breaking down the disease. Variety selection is another key to management. However, resistance does not mean immunity. It seldom does, and the resistance that there is built into the plants is based on several genes with an additive effect. And that resistance is only effective against the leaf phase of infection, not against the systemic blight within the plant. In variety selection, today, most of the companies provide Goss's wilt ratings in their brochures, but there is no third-party or independent testing. So what that means is you can really only compare the resistance of varieties within a single company, not between companies. The best resources for further information on Goss's wilt come from the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, from the seed company's guides, and you can get diagnostics done through our Crop Diagnostics Center in Winnipeg. Are there other diseases in corn? Of course there are, starting at the seedling phase. Some of the other ones that we note from time to time in survey are rust and a smut, which really distorts cobs. And finally, gibberella stalk rot. That's the perfect stage, or the sexual stage, of the fusarium fungus that causes head blight in cereals. In corn, it can cause a decay right around the base, and there is usually a pinkish color associated with it. So that's what I had for you about Goss's wilt. And I don't know if there are any other questions.
Yeah, before we go
talk about, sorry. We should talk about hail and intense rainstorms as a means of infection that opens wounds where the bacteria can get in much more easily than through the natural openings in the leaf. And at the diagnostic school here in Carmen, a year ago, a little more than a year ago, we demonstrated that by artificially hailing some of our plants, and in those we got natural infection of Goss's wilt. Here again is the internal symptom, and that's something we'll be looking for as we survey this year. Have we determined if Anne is on the call yet?
I've got a couple questions before we go to Anne.
Okay.
First one is, you mentioned alternate hosts. Is there any other like cereal crops or annual crops that we grow for in rotation that it could survive on?
I don't believe so. I haven't found any indication of that in all that I have read. None of the small grains are implicated as hosts, only those grassy weeds and some of the native plants that I mentioned.
Okay, and another one that just come in here. When is the best time to scout for Goss's wilt?
Well, that's a good question, Lionel. The symptoms on the leaves can certainly develop prior to silking even, so they can be there quite early. Probably takes a multiple stage approach, and it's good to know if it's there early, because that will determine the intensity and the potential for yield loss. I didn't mention yield loss, but some reports say that where it's bad, it can result in up to 50% grain yield reduction. But we're going to be doing our surveying in middle of September here, and that's a good time. Most of the leaf material is still green, and we can still assess the incidence and impact of the disease.
Okay, and I guess like you mentioned, I guess if you have Goss's wilt in your field, there's really nothing you can do about it once it's there, right?
Not as far as a treatment, no.
Okay.
So just the knowledge that you've got it there should give you some idea about what your rotational planning should be.
Exactly, yeah. Lori, is Anne on?
Yep.
Yes,
she
I'm
is.
on here.
Okay, Anne, do you want to let us know a bit about the survey, I guess? Is that what you're going to be talking about?
Yes, yeah, we're planning a disease survey since David mentioned that there was a Goss's wilt survey in, I think it was 2014, 15, and 16, but we haven't surveyed corn diseases since then. So we thought it'd be a good time to get started on that again. So we're going to be doing a corn disease survey in mid-September, looking at Goss's wilt, anthracnose leaf blight, rust, smut, and stalk rots. So instead of just looking at Goss's wilt as had been done in the past, since it is fairly widespread in Manitoba, we thought it'd be a good idea just to see, what other diseases are affecting corn. So we'll be looking at 50 plants per field at 5 different sites. Just visually looking at the plants to assess the level of disease. And then for stalk rots, with more advanced stalk rots, you could see them from the outside. Otherwise, we will be actually squeezing the stems to see if those stems are spongy and rotten inside. And one thing with corn diseases is it can be difficult to see. I know that some people aren't always sure about things like Goss's wilt or other leaf issues with disease. So we will be sending samples for any of the surveyors that are unsure about whether or not the disease is present. We'll be sending samples to the crop diagnostic lab so we can get a for sure positive or negative on those diseases. And things like rust and smut are fairly easy to tell in the field. So it'll be good to have that data this year from the survey, since we haven't had a good comprehensive survey in the last few years. And we'll be looking at between 60 and 70 fields in total. And Morgan Cott from Manitoba Crop Alliance will be doing a large portion of those fields as well. since she does some weekly scouting on fields across Manitoba. And one other thing that I wanted to mention for the corn survey is as sort of to gather some extra information, John Hurd has put together some information on looking at nitrogen sufficiency in corn based on research done at South Dakota State University. So researchers at South Dakota State University developed a thumb rule to assess nitrogen sufficiency in corn by looking at the severity of lower leaf yellowing in corn. So for this, they're just looking at the fourth leaf below the primary ear, leaf, and assessing if it remains green or if there's any yellow on the leaf. So we'll be doing the same thing on our corn survey so that we can get a good idea of whether or not these plants do have sufficient nitrogen for the potential yield, or whether perhaps drought or lack of nitrogen is impacting total yield. So it'll be interesting to see those results as well.
Okay.
And that's all I
thanks,
have.
Ann. Oh, yeah. Okay, good. Thanks for being on there. And Lori, if you could turn the screen back to me, I think it's time to start our panel. And again, I'd like to welcome our panel members. And if you have questions, there's Lori's email address as well as my email address on the bottom. So you could send them to us. We will try to get them on for the next week's panel. So for the first question, and I guess I kind of brought this one on a little bit, I'm starting to get a lot of questions around frost and damage that can be done, and you know, a couple of the crops that are still pretty vulnerable out there are canola and soybeans. You know, so the question is, what are the risks of early frost and how cold does it need to get to damage some of these crops? So I thought I would give this to both Dennis Lang and Dane Fraze, and maybe we'll start with Dane. If you want to turn the screen over to Dane, Lori, that'd be great.
Great, thanks, Lionel. I'll be quick about this, specifically regarding frost on canola. The extent of damage depends on, well, with any crop, your species, the stage the crop's at, and how hardened off it's been. Soil type and soil moisture are, in fact, extremely critical. The actual air temperature, the duration, and how quickly it drops to a certain temperature. If it's a slow decline to a low temperature, damage is less likely than a quick freeze down to a freezing temperature. Now, high soil moisture acts as an insulator, takes a little longer to cool down. Wetter soils are less likely to have the crop freeze than dry soils if the frost is marginal. Hard frost doesn't really matter at that point. On the bottom of the screen there, I have kind of a rough indication for canola, what it can handle if it's, this is about, what is it about? This would be anything over 20% crop moisture, which translates to about 60 to 70% seed color change. If it's less than that amount of seed color change, it will see damage at some point with the frost, depending on how long it is and how severe it is. But that's where your damage is most likely. So we really want to watch that seed color change and how it equates to certain levels of moisture. About 60% seed color change, which is the traditional swath timing, equates to about 30% moisture. So it has to be more advanced in color than that in order to escape damage. If it's less advanced than that, there's damage likely, and it's somewhat inevitable, but it's how to deal with it and how severe it could be. Advance my slide here. Okay. Now, specifically regarding a light frost if swathing, check in the afternoon or early evening the day after the frost for wilting. You're looking at the stems for speckling. You can kind of see here in the image. Oops, let me see if I can draw here. Not sure if you can. Oops, not sure if you can see that. I'm looking at the pods in the person's hand here. You can see there's a light white freckling on those pods. That is symptomatic of a very light frost damage, 0 to -2 kind of thing. If the crop is not wilting and still shiny, Let it stand and check daily for a seed color change. It will advance fairly quickly after this point. A light frost may in fact be helpful to help dry down the plant naturally. The speckling is of little concern as long as the plant is alive. And if you're looking at a heavy frost, the damage does show up sooner, early afternoon. Check for the wilting, those white pods where they are extremely desiccated, those cells have been ruptured. If that's the case, pod drop could begin within a day, especially if you're following a frost with warm, sunny afternoons. If those pods are desiccating rapidly, swath right away to preserve as much yield as possible. Swathing during periods of dew or high humidity might help reduce the amount of pod shelling and pod drop if they are beginning to fall off. But if the crop is still really green, and if you're forecasted for a heavy frost for a long duration, consider swathing early. You certainly will give up yield, and you certainly will lock in chlorophyll and green seed at that point. But you could estimate a yield loss of more like 16 to 30% versus a more severe crop loss if your crop is running late. So do keep an eye on the forecast. Lionel did share a shot of what the forecast was for Russell. I believe in the next week, the long-term forecast, there was a one overnight low of -1. I wouldn't be extremely concerned at this point. However, do keep an eye on that forecast and know what your seed color changes and when you're able to earliest get into the field. So with that, Lionel, I could turn it over to Dennis.
Okay, Dennis, some comments on soybeans?
Yes, if you can throw the screen over to me, that would be great.
Okay.
Alrighty, we're just gonna make my screen a little bit bigger. So over the years, we have had frost on soybeans. The worst one that I've been involved with was way back when in 2004, where we had a frost in August, and you can see here it was definitely a frost where you can see the soybean pods actually crystallize the little hairs on there. That was the worst I've ever seen. Since then, most of the frost that we have seen on soybeans has been very, very light. You know, like a -1, maybe -2 for short periods of time. You can see here that it basically just kind of crisped up the leaves a little bit. So we haven't had any major issues with that over the years. Now, what can happen though is if that -2, -3 does come in for a few hours, you may get some of this green seed kind of locking in here. Now, again, this is an extreme case, and the beans still have to be at the correct stage for that frost to really show up. So a couple of things to kind of keep in mind. If you're at the R5 growth stage, that's when a frost can really affect the yield. That's 50 to 70% yield loss. Most of the beans now are in the R6 growth stage, and we're getting towards the tail end of that. So there you can still see some yield loss, but it's still pretty minor. And once you hit the R7 growth stage, where you will see one mature natural color pod on the plant, as you can see in this slide here, this is from the Natural Pulse and Soybean Growers. And you can see here, once you start to get that natural color on the pod, then you're out of the woods for yield loss. You still may see a little bit of that green seed issue we talked about if it's a hard frost. The -1 really wouldn't do anything to it. But once you get to that full R8 growth stage is what you see here, or brown pod stage, you're not going to really see any losses whatsoever or any color issues. So for the most part, you know, a -1 frost really isn't going to affect you at all. It might just help speed maturity along a little bit, clip off a few of the top leaves. It would have to get pretty cold for it to be affected now. And most of the soybeans are into that R6 growth stage. So a week from now, things are probably going to be okay for the most part.
Hey, great. Thanks, Dennis. Dennis, while I have you on the screen still, the next question that has come up and have got a couple calls is some producers are talking that sudden death syndrome showing up in their soybeans. Some browning in the fields is what it's actually coming in as. My soybeans are starting to turn brown in spots and patches in fields, and sometimes fairly large patches. So can you address that one?
So there's a few things that can cause that. You know, if you have some root rot issues starting to show up in the field, you want to do a closer inspection of that. Dig up those areas and just see what the roots look like, if there's some browning on the roots. We do see at this time of the year some natural senescence. You can see here in the images that Lionel provided to me here. Oh, here you go. Yeah, you can see some of these lower leaves start to drop, and soybeans do that as well. If an area is maybe a little bit further along in the field, you see some natural senescence in that. So that's pretty typical for this time of the year. Soybeans will start, you'll see, you know, more stressed areas that maybe finish off a little quicker. I would investigate that just to look at the roots. That would be, to me, the major thing that you'd be seeing out there. I pulled up some images online here from Minnesota on sudden death syndrome. So you can see here, if you go to the previous image here, here you'll see just kind of a natural yellowing of the plant. The lower leaves start to drop off. That's normal for this time of the year. But when you have something like sudden death syndrome, it looks a lot different. You'll see the little pot marks within the between the veins start to show up. You'll see a lot of chlorosis around those areas. The veins typically stay pretty green. We have not confirmed any sudden death syndrome in Manitoba. There's been some suspected samples that have been sent in, but nothing that's been confirmed at this point. So I wouldn't kind of jump down that rabbit hole quite yet. It's nothing that I'd be concerned with as of today, but it's something that I think in the future we'll see in Manitoba. Eventually, the more beans we grow, the more diseases that we see here. So for the most part, what you're seeing is probably natural senescence, but I would also investigate to see whether or not, look at the roots, look for some root rot, and if you are digging up those roots, look at them for a potential SCN as well, because we have had some, last year we had some confirmed cases come in for SCN where we were able to see the nematode egg sacs right on the stems, but for the most part, probably just natural senescence.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yep, thanks.
And Lori, if you could turn the screen back to me. Great, thank you. Next question is going to be a two-part question, but the first one is going to go to John Hurd. What do we take off the field in nutrients from seed and straw?
Okay, thank you, Lionel. Yes, this is a question that we're seeing. In some cases, the balers are into the field before the combines are finished. So there's demand for that straw, either for, you know, bedding or feeding or erosion control stuff. So that's a question we often get. It's a question we have to just put a lot of assumptions on, as far as the quantity of straw that's coming off and the nutrient value of that straw. And we've done some studies, surveys in the past. If a grower wants to know exactly, they would just kind of take like a forage analysis of that straw so that they would know what the nitrogen, phosphate, potash content is. But if we use, you know, something that is in our soil fertility booklet, it looks like in each ton of straw, there's about 25 pounds of nitrogen, 9 to 10 of phosphate, but 55 of potash, and 5 pounds of sulfur. The big one is potash. And when we did studies, we found that ranged tremendously, ranged from 15 to 60 pounds per ton. And that depends on whether your straw gets rained on much before harvest, or if it's in the swath and gets rained on. Potassium will just leach out of straw and material. And so we may not be removing a lot of potassium from the field if that field has been washed before harvest. But if it's been dry right to harvest, then the potential is that you've got some higher removals. When I take those standard numbers and kind of calculate them by some of the standard fertilizer costs for NPK and S, I would say what, and this is presuming like good wheat yields, 60 bushels plus, will produce 1.5 tons of straw per acre. And if we're looking at 1.5 tons of straw, that would be equivalent of about $28 of nutrients if you're on a clay soil, or $59, $60 of nutrients if you're on a sandy soil. And the reason I say that, if you're on a sandy soil, that potassium is really important to you. If you're not returning it in the straw, then you should probably be buying it from the fertilizer dealer. If you're on clay soils, where I value that straw at more like $30 in that 1.5 ton, that's primarily the nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur content, because on average, clay soils tend to have luxurious amounts of potassium. But that's why it's really up to the individual to decide. If you're going to harvest straw and sell, it's far better to come from your heavier textured fields than from your sandy fields. That Lionel is kind of what I have on the straw. In an ideal world, if you're selling your straw or going to a livestock producer, you would simply trade back, for every 2 to 3 tons of straw, you'd get a ton of manure coming back. But, it doesn't always work that way.
Yeah, good comment, John. Okay, while we're on this screen, got a question for Ann Kirk. And I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar today that a lot of the wheat is coming off in high moisture, 18% range anyways. And a lot of producers are getting protein tests done, and when they're getting it sampled and hearing protein levels of 13 to 15. The question is that was asked was, as it dries, am I going to lose some of that protein?
So the actual amount of protein in your wheat isn't affected by the moisture content. So that's why, as the wheat, when you have wetter wheat, each kernel would be heavier. So the actual amount of protein might be slightly lower. So as wheat dries, then since the amount of actual protein remains the same, it should make up a greater percentage of the actual kernel. But to kind of avoid that, that's why we specify wheat protein percentage at a certain percent moisture. So we might be saying, wheat protein at 13.5% moisture, 14.5%, whatever they state, just to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing, because it, could change a little bit, but the actual amount of protein in the kernel remains the same. And just kind of looking up information for this, if we're talking about, say harvesting your wheat at 18% moisture or 16% moisture and putting the aeration on the bin to get it down to 14.5, that's very different than I'd had seen some studies where people are harvesting wheat at extremely high moisture, so in the 30, 40%. And then you would could see some effects, negative effects on the protein, just in terms of denaturing the protein, because a lot of heat would be required to really reduce the amount of moisture in your wheat sample. But I think in general, Manitobans are talking about reducing the moisture percentage by a few percent, not a huge drastic amount.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ann. That's good information.
Hey, Lionel, can I butt in for a sec? It's
Sure,
John. Yeah, I don't think you've muted me yet. Because there's this question about nutrient value in our various crops, we're actually working with the company Nutrien this fall. We'll be working with them to collect up several thousand grain samples across the prairies. And out of University of Saskatchewan, we're going to be doing some analyses to actually figure out, what are the normal amounts, normal range in the average amount of fertilizer nutrients removed in a number of grain crops. So I would just say, stay tuned. We're looking to update our historic values when it comes to what's removed in the grain portion of the crop.
Okay, that's good to know, and I got your email on that the other day, so yeah, good. That should be some good information.
Yeah, we'll help where we can to complement that.
Before we mute you, anyways, the next question is going to be for you, and we kind of talked about it a bit in Dave's presentation with Ann, but the yellowing of the leaves and the lower leaves of corn, besides talking disease all the time, your opinions as what might be going on there.
Yes, okay. Yeah, it is. Being the soil fertility person, of course, I'm always looking at, well, what's the nutrient at play here? And there's two main nutrients, lack of nutrients that cause yellowing of lower leaves. There's nitrogen and potassium. And nitrogen, that's when you get the yellow, the yellowing of the midrib of the leaf, starting at the tip and moving up. So that's characteristic of nitrogen deficiency. Potassium deficiency is when you get scorching on the leaf margins. And if I'm seeing that in the crop, that's kind of an indication to me that I may have poor stalk strength. So if I'm seeing potassium deficiency in my field, that is not the field I want to leave out over winter, or it's going to have reduced stalk strength. That's one that I would prefer to take early. But back to the nitrogen, the corn plant by mid-August has taken up 75% of the nitrogen it needs, and it tends to store it in the bottom of the plant, in the stalk and in those leaves. And as we get to grain fill, then it starts to move the nitrogen out. But if we get into drought conditions, it's not, the plant takes up nitrogen through mass flow, and that simply means it takes up nitrogen that comes along with the ride when it transpires water. And if we have limited water in the soil, we have limited transpiration, and we've got limited nitrogen getting into the plant. And so that's why drought-stressed plants, they start drawing on those nitrogen reserves early. And so a drought deficient plant will already be early drawing on the nitrogen out of those lower leaves. And so those leaves will start yellowing, not because they've run out of moisture, but because the nitrogen is being drawn out of them. So in both cases, the yellow leaves are due to nitrogen deficiency. In some cases, it may be because of a lack of nitrogen. Other cases, it's a lack of water that allows nitrogen uptake.
So this year with some of the extreme growth that we're seeing in some of the crops as well, will we be seeing that, or they're just starting to run out of nitrogen as well?
Yeah, I think so. And this is what tends to befuddle people sometimes, because they'll say, oh shoot, ran out of nitrogen, I must not have any or much left in the soil. Well, in fact, there may still be amounts left in the soil. It's just that we didn't have the water to help carry it into the plant. So just because we see these plants showing some visual nitrogen deficiency, it don't always mean that we ran the tank dry in nitrogen, and soil testing is important for that.
Okay, great. Thanks, John. Oh, I guess I wasn't done with you yet, John. Sorry about that. Got a lot of guys finishing harvesting their peas. So how much nitrogen can I expect from my this year's pea crop for next year?
Okay, well, it kind of depends where you are. I know North Dakota says they give across the board 40-pound credit. In Saskatchewan, I think they suggest a thumb rule, a bit like 1/2 to 1 pound of nitrogen per bushel of peas. And in Manitoba, when we were kind of pushed to come up with a contribution, we're about 25 pounds. Now, when I look into our data, our studies that were done, some 20 years ago, it's pretty sketchy on this. It shows a wide range of nitrogen contribution, and it does not always scale up with higher yields. In fact, if you're getting an 80 bushel crop of peas, it doesn't necessarily mean you're contributing twice the amount of nitrogen as a 40 bushel crop. You're actually removing a lot of that nitrogen when you harvest your peas. So, there's been work out of Alberta that shows that pea residue, if it's left on the surface, within 4 to 5 weeks, most of the nitrogen that's going to mineralize out of that pea crop, it's in the soil. So my suggestion is, rather than using a thumb rule, particularly if you have some high yields of peas where we're stretching that thumb rule to look at a credit, that probably just delay your soil testing on your pea fields until later in October. And that is probably going to give you a more realistic value of the nitrogen you'll have. We can start soil sampling our cereal fields right now. The cereal fields, they don't change very much in nitrogen over the fall. We don't tend to have a lot of mineralization of nitrogen, but it's a different story with peas. And so if I had pea fields, those are fields where you'd want to delay your soil sampling until later in October.
Okay, so would that be the same logic then used for, say, fields like soybeans or faba beans?
Maybe faba beans, but soybeans, I think we know enough about them that the soybeans, they just remove almost all the nitrogen that there is. And so we frequently find our lowest levels of soil nitrogen follow soybeans. They're just too efficient at packaging the nitrogen in the seed and it being harvested. So really in the prairies, we've had about 3 big studies on that, and we find precious little contribution to next year's crop. So we just take our soil test and fertilize accordingly. We really don't have evidence to offer a credit here.
Okay, thanks, John. One question that just came in here, and I guess John Gavlosky, this one would be for you. I'm harvesting high moisture wheat and was thinking of adding diatomaceous earth with as I'm putting it in the bin. Is that a good idea?
It is if you suspect you might have stored grain insects in there. Now, high moisture wheat, often we have more incidence of foreign grain beetle, which is a beetle that feeds on mold. And really the easiest way to deal with that is dealing with the high moisture, rather than relying on the diatomaceous earth. If you've got the high moisture, you're going to have other things that are going to be issues down the road. Generally, I recommend scout and use things such as diatomaceous earth as needed. So put probe traps in your bins and see if there's actually beetles in there, rather than just using it as a precaution. And again, dealing with things like foreign grain beetle, try to deal with the moisture the best you can.
Right, because you get rid of the mold would be the biggest issue with the wet grain, right?
That's correct. Now there's other insects that can get in there too. Foreign grain beetles, one, but rusty grain beetle. But rusty grain beetle is not so dependent on the moisture. But once again, we usually recommend put some probe traps in the bin, be checking, and take action when needed. Okay,
great. Thanks, John. Okay, so now we come to the few ending slides for today, and seasonal crop reports are still being done, so that information is on our website. The Manitoba Hay Listing Service is still there. I've been getting a few calls from producers that have hay or feed for sale. So definitely been advising them to put it listed there. So if you're looking for feed or have somebody interested in feed, tell them to go to the Manitoba Hay Listing Service. I put up the crop residue burning authorization. So if you're looking at doing any burning, you need to be checking that, as it'll be on a daily basis updated. So definitely go there to check on that. Again, the farm production extension people in Manitoba. So if you have questions regarding anything you've heard on the webinars, or got questions, anything that's happening in your area, feel free to contact any one of these people. And that's it for today. Join us next week. It'll be September the 9th. And we talked about frost, so hopefully nothing happens. So see you next week.